Okay, great. So welcome everybody to today's workshop. This is really exciting for me to present to you all. This is a new workshop that the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program has put on. Prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species and best practices for Adirondack anglers. So a note before we get started, I am coming to this role from the Pacific Northwest, the Oregon coast to be specific, where people, especially if you love fishing, you might love the artist Ray Troll. And so I've tried to include as much of his work, this Oregon artist and Alaskan artist, throughout to try to get people excited about salmon and fish and ecosystems and a lot of fish puns. So yes, no, there will be a lot of Ray Troll art throughout. And a lot of people are new to angling in general. It's become, one of the primary social distance activities that you could participate in throughout the world, which is really exciting that people are also returning to it. I hope that there's a lot of traditional anglers on the line today, but I'm going to do that forever. But I hope there's also a lot of new anglers joining us. So it's really exciting, and I myself I'll get into it. I'm more of a salmon nerd, I'm a fish nerd, I'm a habitat nerd. And so I've also called on some of my colleagues who are more, angling experts or experienced, fish biologists to also join us to answer some more technical questions. So just getting into an overview of where we're going today, I'm going to give a brief introduction. I've already started on that. Part 2, we're going to get into some definitions of what aquatic invasive species are. Let's all be on the same page. It can get a little complicated when we're talking about fish in particular, but we're also going to talk about ecosystem impacts, economic impacts of aquatic invasive species, and social impacts of aquatic invasive species, because angling is not just an economic engine. It's not just, an ecological, issue where if our habitat is good, but it's an emotional, social, cultural, historic practice. Also getting into definitions, when I say aquatic invasive species, I might shorten it here and there to just be AIS. And then, so part 3, we'll get into prevention best practices while you're out there in the Adirondacks angling. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about bait. We're going to talk about gear choices, and we're going to talk about, your basic clean, drain, dry principles. You may have heard it before, but it's so vital and so important to protecting our habitat that it's always important to review and, proselytize to everybody in the circle. And then towards the end, we're going to talk about, we're going to have our Q&A. So in the chat today, before I talk more about myself, I'd like you to use the chat function just to get you used to using it, because this is how we're going to collect questions throughout the talk. I have colleagues monitoring the chat so that we can organize and streamline all of our questions towards the end. It helps us keep things also, topical, so we don't jump across. So if you in the chat box could say who you are, where you're zooming in from, what you like to fish for. You don't have to give away your spots. You don't have to say where you like to fish. But if there is a general river you love in the Adirondacks or a lake that you love in the Adirondacks, please pop that in there. So as I said, my name is Emily Bell-Dinan. I'm coming to you from Saranac Lake. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. I have my email here, but I'll also post it up at the end. Though you've all gotten a lot of emails from me already. So you have my info, but I will, present it here. As I said, I am coming to this position from working in a lot of salmon restoration, where I really fell in love with fish and sort of joined the cult of salmon, which I don't think you ever can get out of. You kind of just become obsessive and very interested. But that being said, I'm not really, the prize catching, angler that I hope to be. So I've also pulled in our friend Carrie Ann Pershin who is the Biodiversity Research Manager at the Osceola River Association. So she's also going to help me with the Q&A for any really specific technical questions you may have that are outside of habitat or aquatic invasive species or prevention practices, or also just to bolster all that information, because she's been living and working in the Adirondacks for a long time and she's really great. So as we get going, oh, thank you so much for using so much of the chat. This is really exciting. Cool. All right, I love that everybody knows this, what their favorite places are. And also you might be learning about your new favorite places. So I'm going to get into that a little bit as well. Before we move forward, just a little bit about the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, or APIP, as we're, our common name. We are a program that is housed and managed by the Nature Conservancy in New York, up in the Adirondacks. And we are funded and co-managed by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Our goals are to prevent new introductions of invasive species, rapidly detect and eradicate small new infestations of invasive species before they grow out of control, and to manage existing priority infestations in order to mitigate impacts, ecological, economic, and social. We have many different programs in which we carry out this work. We work on land, we work in water, and a lot of our prevention and awareness work, because prevention, it's a lot cheaper and easier and more logistically possible to control invasive species if they don't occur in the first place. So a lot of our prevention work is what I do through education and outreach. The Adirondacks are a really unique area, not just in the Northeast, not just in New York, but around North America, where we have such a limited number of terrestrial and aquatic invasive species impacting our incredibly diverse, important, and large-scale habitats. So we work with lots of people from across the state and from around the world and from around the country who come to visit the Adirondacks to help them know how important it is to maintain best practices in order to protect our incredibly diverse, rare habitats here. But I'm also talking to a lot of folks who live and work in the Adirondacks too, so I'm excited. If you're zooming in, and then the last note is, if you're zooming in from another part of the state or even another neighboring state, there's a lot of resources in your area. And in New York, I'll send out a link after the workshop to connect you to the PRISM. So we're a PRISM, a Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management in your area. So a little bit more Rachel, and we'll get into part 2 and talk about some definitions of aquatic invasive species. So this can be a little bit of a complicated topic. There's some social constructions to sort of break up here, but what does invasive mean? Primarily, when we give a species, a plant, an animal, even a pathogen, the label invasive, it means it causes harm. So we have observed ecological damage, economic damage, or social damage caused by that organism. That is a relative term though, right? So where that species comes from might not matter, but what it's doing in its new place really matters. So just to break it down a little bit more, we have invasive species. Out west, you might hear the term noxious species. And that's really the type of species we're talking about that causes this harm. Ecological harm, economic or social harm. The poster child for causing harm, I'm thinking a lot about zebra mussels right now, because there was some zebra mussels found being sold by accident in a pet store in some balls of moss, which is actually a national occurrence, but we had it pop up in Burlington at a pet store. And so, oh no, these freshwater, highly invasive, damaging bivalves were found very, very locally. So I need to think about it and talk to the public about it as much as possible. But you might also have nuisance species, right? So a common weed that causes no, ecological, social, or economic harm to anyone. There's no observation of it doing anything. Just because it's not necessarily native to this area, if it's not doing anything, that might be fine, certainly we're not able to, use a lot of resources to impact something. And sometimes they're actually beneficial. So in this dandelion, which has been in North America for at least since the 1600s, most likely earlier, coming in ship ballast from Europe, there's a European honeybee. So we also get a lot of ecosystem services from some non-native species as well, right? And then you have non-native or introduced species. And this is where it gets super complicated talking about fish, because right here I have, a landlocked salmon, which hasn't been found in a lot of areas for, decades and decades and decades, but they've been brought back from one specific genetic stock. And so they're not necessarily native. They once were prolific around here in the Great Lakes. But are they native? Are they non-native? Are they introduced? It gets complicated. So we go back to this question of, is it causing harm? And then thinking about this, biogeographical context matters. So a great example of this with fish is that lake trout, a prize fish in the Adirondacks in New York State. We love them. They're great. They're delicious. They're big. If you can catch them, you've done a great job. But in Yellowstone, they're one of the most harmful fish around. They've been introduced there as a sport fish back in, I don't know, probably the teens or 20s, possibly earlier. And so they're really causing a huge amount of ecological harm in Yellowstone lakes. And then the rainbow trout is a great example too, where they're native to the West Coast and have been introduced to the East Coast as a sport fish as well. And excuse me, sorry, I've got a German Shepherd Husky that likes to talk. Rainbow trout have been introduced to this area as a sport fish, and it depends pond to pond, right, of what other species are present in that pond that a rainbow trout might cause harm to. It might not cause any harm because other species are no longer present. So it gets really complicated. So I just want to point out this causing harm, ecological, economic, and social. Right. So then how does some non-native species become invasive? Where do they get this label? Some key characteristics of life, cycles. A lot of species lack predators and parasites to keep their populations in check. I have here a spiny water flea. I'm going to talk about those a little bit. Or fish hook water flea, which many of you may have heard of. You can't typically see these with the naked eye unless they're bundled on your fishing lines, but their exoskeleton, it's a type of zooplankton in fresh water. It is an invasive species and it really disrupts the bottom of the food web where zooplankton and phytoplankton are, the basis of life on Earth. But their exoskeleton is so awful that nothing eats it. So not only do they eat everything, nothing eats them. So they lack predators and parasites to keep their populations in check. Producing prolific offspring and seeds, purple loosestrife, in especially wetland areas is a really important plant to be aware of when you're hiking out to fishing spots, particularly in midsummer, late summer, when they're going to seed. One plant produces millions of seeds, and those become more plants, and then those plants become millions of seeds, and then it's just an exponential increase in population. A lot of invasive species, and this is plant or reproduced by multiple means. So hydrilla, which is a really damaging aquatic invasive species plant that can do this to your waterways. It's like a Godzilla of plants, though some people argue that Godzilla might have been good, so maybe that's a bad example too. It's complicated with Godzilla, but it can reproduce through vegetative chunks, right, just like pieces of plant that come off in your boat motor, but also through tubers. So if these little tiny tubers, these little tiny roots are found in water in your kayak and you go from lake to lake, you can bring hydrilla around with you as well. So reproducing by multiple means. Generalists, so rusty crayfish, we'll talk about this dude. They're not even from that far away. They're from Ohio, okay? But they're prolific eaters. They'll eat everything in their path, plants and animals alike. And they're living in the benthic layer, so for a tiny trout egg, for a salmon egg, for a tiny, fingerling trout that's, an inch long and trying to just grow up through the summer, and this guy comes along, you're in bad luck. And then monopolizing resources. So all of these tools that some species use when they're in a new area and they're not being kept in check, there's no ecological balance for them. It becomes sort of a monocrop, and then it begins to monopolize resources. So then we get to a tipping point where we're pushing out all other life in an ecosystem. So when we have a monocrop, we have a lack of biodiversity. And biodiversity, I don't think I have to tell you all, it's incredibly important in order to maintain ecosystems, in order to maintain food webs, in order to, mitigate climate, in order to have fresh water. So just some points about the importance of biodiversity in the context of the Adirondacks. It's the foundation of a food web, right? Starting with zooplankton or starting with soil microbes. We're creating food and shelter and rearing habitat for many different types of native fish. We're storing and filtering and cooling fresh water. And we'll get into the importance of cold water a bit too, especially if you're really into trout. You're also, and I want to keep bringing up that we're not just going to talk about aquatic habitats, we're also going to talk about the riparian zone. So what's along the river, what's on land next to water, cooling water. So when we lose biodiversity adjacent to water, we're also losing all the plants that stabilize shorelines. And so you have increased erosion rates, which have, getting an internet connection is unstable. So I hope you all can still hear me. If I could see some thumbs up, that would be helpful. We want to reduce erosion for a litany, thank you, Carolyn, a litany of reasons. We want to keep the soil where it is and out of the water. An economic engine, right? So Adirondacks rely on tourism, but fishing is also vital for food. And biodiversity is also vital for human health. So we're mitigating climate. It's much healthier to, not be overheated or be worried about drought or be worried about fire. It's important for research, agriculture, real estate value even. Cycling greenhouse gases and producing oxygen. I won't go into why we need oxygen, but we definitely need it. And then it's just inherently important, right? Everything has inherent value. Doesn't have to benefit me to be important. So, oh, sorry, I don't know why that's an animation. So aquatic invasive species, we're going to lose that biodiversity and there will be food web disruptions. This is why I'm just going to hammer this home so that we all know why we need to be as practicing our preventive measures as possible. There can be massive food web disruption, and that spiny water flea is a big part of it. So those guys are being found in Lake Champlain and other places where we're breaking down the food web from the very, very bottom, which is kind of scary. Decreased light and oxygen and space and resources for other plant life. A lot of aquatic invasive species, I'll get into this in a second, help lead to having warmer waters, which totally shift our fish populations in general. As I mentioned, I'll do it again and again and again, but stream bank erosion can smother fish rearing habitats. So we're going to smother those little tiny rocks and pebbles where fish lay their eggs and where tiny rearing fish grow up and eat leaves and eat insects and get bigger and stronger, but also can hide. Stream bank erosion can also lead to eutrophication, which is going to have your fish kills or your increased algal blooms. And then you can also increase pathogens or introduce pathogens with aquatic invasive species. And we'll get into that a little bit, probably more in the Q&A about fish diseases. And we'll talk about it with bait as well. So we don't want to introduce pathogens. This is the year of pathogens, and I don't want any more. So when I talk about invasive species helping move along water warming, this is something that I think is really important to think about. But in the Adirondacks, the impacts of climate change, a change in climate, are already being seen. Oh no, am I freezing? Okay. We're seeing the impact of climate change. So we're having lower precipitation, higher ambient temperatures, lower snow fall, earlier snow melt, and this is all impacting the temperature of what are supposed to be cold Adirondack waters, which are used by cold water fish. So your trout, your smelt, your lake trout, even your brook trout especially, and it's being studied and known that, or discovered that a lot of cold water fish have a higher likelihood of surviving climate change if they have a diverse, stratified cold water habitat to escape into different levels of during the summer. So if you're fishing during the summer, you're probably going to put more weight on your line so that your bait goes a little further down, so that, because that's where your fish are. When you have some invasive species, particularly bivalves, so your quagga mussels, your zebra mussels, Asian clams, they're filter feeders. So they're actually cleaning a lot of phytoplankton and zooplankton out of the water. A lot of Adirondack, so we might think, oh, that's nice. But a lot of Adirondack waters are actually supposed to be kind of dark. So we have a lot of tannins in the water from maple leaves and from oak leaves, which really stain a lot of our waters to be that kind of brown color, where visitors might think that's weird that the water is brown in the Adirondacks, but it's supposed to be that way. So that dark color actually blocks a lot of light, which keeps it cold. When you have less light, things are colder. And so when you have these invasive bivalves and they're cleaning the water, you have deeper light penetration. So when you have deeper light penetration, you have warmer waters, and you lose that stratification where cold water fish hide out in different times of the year when waters are already warming due to climate change. When light can penetrate deeper into the water column, and you might also have invasive plants present, those invasive plants can then also colonize further down into the water. And that any ability for that lack of a monoculture for an invasive plant like milfoil is lessened. So it may have been able to only exist on 6 to 10 feet of water, and now it can start to move into much deeper parts of the lake as well, where it's going to push out that native biodiversity. So just a note about that. And then I won't spend too much time about economic impacts, but they're vast. So you'll have reduced fish productivity, which can reduce your own food. It might not be a commercial fishery, but it will certainly impact recreation and tourism, which is a huge economic engine in our area, and can also stymie or actively lower property values, especially if this is your lakefront now with stream bank erosion. Drinking water quality infrastructure can absolutely be damaged by, here's that zebra mussel again, aquatic invasive species. And there can be, incredible threats to human and pet health. Cyanobacteria was a big scare in the Lake George area over the past summer. And a lot of algae or single-cell organism algae can release a lot of acids in the water that can be poisonous to dogs, or macroalgae can cause skin rashes. I won't go into that too much, but you also have your cultural losses, right? You want these fish to be here, you want these plants to be here, you want these traditions to remain, you want to not have a loss of species. So we emphasize prevention as the best medicine. So here's an example of purple loosestrife. From one plant can become many, where it becomes completely infeasible to eradicate this level of infestation here. So we're going to focus on prevention now, and it really does work. It really does work, as does early detection rapid response. So the work that APIP has been doing over the past 20 years really, really works. And the work that you all do, even joining a workshop like this really works as well. We have success stories from early detection, rapid response. I know I've given you all a lot of bad news. I'm a total bummer, but we have success stories from training citizen scientists to go out and look for aquatic invasive species before they proliferate in numbers. And then we have huge amounts just from prevention work of success that we'll never be able to fully calculate, right? So in the Adirondacks, we believe from our monitoring, our 20 years of monitoring that, 10 years of monitoring, I can't do math, that's 18 years of monitoring. Over 75% of the lakes we monitor every year in different cycles are 75%. 75% of those lakes are free of aquatic invasive species through prevention work, through education, through outreach, through clean, drain, dry principles. And 108 lakes with aquatic invasive species might seem like a lot, but we have thousands of lakes in the Adirondacks and ponds and rivers that are visited by tourists from around the world every year. So this is incredible. And it's so rare, and so it's just so incredibly vital that we maintain this for generations to come. So let's get into best practices for Adirondack anglers. And I want to spend a little bit of time about bait. Feel free to correct me towards, in the Q&A section. If we have a lot of, trout experts on the line, it's so easy to use that. We'll talk about it. So I'm going to talk about bait, and I'm going to talk about trout, because brook trout are really, specific to the Adirondacks. There's a lot of fishing information you can find that's applicable to all parts of our state, but what's really unique to the Adirondacks are brook trout. So this is the state fish. It is a little tiny fish. Sometimes they can get bigger, but they're, not the biggest numbers. So when you do find them, it might be small, it'll be catch and release, and you appreciate it and you put it back. So brook trout were once found widely across New York State, and they evolved in these isolated ponds with little competition from other fish. So when you hike up, 2,000 feet and you find a pond, that might be where brook trout is. And so with evolving over eons without any competition, once there are additional fish introduced to an ecosystem through recreation, you start to have die off. You start to lose a lot of that population because they're really not very competitive guys. In the Adirondacks, the Saranac for wild forest is used as a pretty common example of monitoring for existing brook trout, but it's believed that now only 3 to 5% of they're only living in 3 to 5% of their once historic reach. And again, this is complicated. So when I say brook trout, I'm not only specifically pointing to, so that 3 to 5% of historic reach, those are, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but genetically native fish. So not necessarily raised in a fish hatchery and then reintroduced for the purpose of continuing the species, which DEC does. And so after this point, and I refer to brook trout, I might be referring to genetically, historic fish or wild fish, or I might be also referring to brook trout raised by DEC to continue the species. So if that's my little disclaimer there. And so because brook trout are so incredibly non-competitive and so incredibly out-competed by other fish, it's really, really, really vital. It's not only vital, it's law, but to protect waters from the introduction of non-native species, the use of live bait fish is prohibited in most brook trout ponds. So we're going to emphasize that you use certified non-invasive earthworms, and I'll get into what that means in a second, for spinning and spin casting, or, you could get into the wild world of fly fishing. which is one of my life goals. So I won't be offering any fly fishing advice in this workshop by any means, but I will be talking about bait. So to reiterate, in brook trout ponds, and I'll help you find how to find those ponds, the use of live bait fish is prohibited. But the DEC has really great resources on how to find where those trout ponds are in the Adirondacks, both in Region 5 and in Region 6. And I'm going to send out a lot of these links after the workshop. This might be, an old hat for a lot of you, but I also wanted to make sure that these resources were reaching our new anglers, because the Adirondacks are very, very unique. So the DEC has reclaimed trout ponds where, through many different means, have made these ponds where it's just brook trout. And there might also be areas where, well, we'll talk about regulations in a little bit, but just for an example, if we go to the Adirondack Lake Champlain fishing region, DEC Region 5, close that email so it doesn't keep bouncing around. Let's see, I've put in a lot of links here, so I hope it works. My internet might be too unstable. Haha. So the DEC is going to be your best friend to know where and where not to use live bait fish in the Adirondacks. It's also going to help you find where those brook trout ponds are, because, why come to the Adirondacks if you're not going to go find trout? So every county has a list of, specific fishing opportunities, along with different regulations. So just going to Essex County as an example, or I'm sorry, let's take it a step back. So know before you go, right? Where are those reclaimed trout ponds in the Adirondacks? If this is something you're really interested in getting into, this is something you need to be researching when you're planning your day. So these are going to be all of, the different general wilderness area or general areas where you're going to go, different towns and names of water bodies so that you can get to those hiking spots. And this is absolutely where live bait fish are prohibited. So know before you go and try to find some of these reclaimed trout ponds in the Adirondacks. It's an adventure in native fish. But you can also find that list of county fishing spots, which will have their own specific regulations. So for example, I'm going to go to the Hoffman Notch Wilderness. We're going to have different regulations based on different ponds. So I might be finding it based on, closeness of where I'm at. I know there's a lot of folks on the line here from the Schroon Lake area. So, okay, I live near Schroon Lake, and so, or the town of Schroon. I'm going to go find Bailey Pond. And this asterisk denotes that it is prohibited to have live bait fish in that area. So you can find different fishing spots, and there are different bait regulations in a couple of different ways. And so what I'm trying to say is exactly that. And I can share out all of these links with everybody after. And then Carrie Ann can talk about this towards the end in our Q&A, or maybe even pipe in now. But another specific water body with its own regulations in our area, and there might be more that I'm not too aware of, so I do apologize, but the west branch of the Osceola River is going to be artificial lures only. So even though I said in reclaimed trout ponds, you can have your worms, in the west branch of the Osceola River, it's artificial lures only and catch and release only. And there are certain sections of the river that are catch and release, and there are certain sections that are not catch and release. So for more specifics on the Osceola River, do visit the Osceola River Association website. They have excellent resources, and I'll share that out after the workshop as well. So just to reiterate, the big thing: do not use live bait fish in trout ponds in the Adirondacks. Might be Region 5, might be Region 6. Okay, and then there's your green list of bait fish in New York. This is a longer list based on statewide angling regulations, and this applies where special regulations are not. So special regulations would be that trout pond regulation that I just mentioned. This green list of bait fish is only to be used where legal use of bait fish, where it's legal to use bait fish. That being said, there are 2 bait fish on this approved New York State list that we would recommend you do not use in the Adirondacks. And that is because they're very competitive with our native brook trout. And just in case they were to get out, just in case they were to colonize an area, just in case they were to do a great job in surviving here, are the blunt-nosed minnow and the golden shiner. Golden shiner is one of the most popular live bait fishes that you can find. So again, we recommend not using those in the Adirondacks. Outside of the Adirondacks, they are on the New York State green list of live bait fish that are okay to use if you're using it certified. So now, in addition to following those regulations I've just mentioned, the really important thing to remember is to use certified bait fish only. Oh no, we're not there yet. So this actually qualifies, this applies to worms as well. So use certified bait fish, certified worms, certified bait. And when we say certified, that means that the seller has correctly identified the species and correctly identified that they are disease-free. Now, what does it mean to be certified? It's not too high-tech. You're not going to find like too many websites that say, here's where you find all the certified bait being sold in these areas. But that seller takes responsibilities for identifying the species and identifying that it's disease-free. And to be certified, when you're buying your bait and you're coming up for your fishing trip, you know where you're going to go. The seller must provide a receipt that includes the following. You need to carry this receipt while you're fishing: the seller's name, the date of sale, the species of fish, and the number of each species sold. So I bought 5 of this, 6 of that, 10 of this, and I'm carrying that receipt with me. And it has the seller's name, the date of sale, and the number and name of all the species I bought. And I'm carrying it with me. After 10 days, that receipt is considered expired. And so it's considered no longer certified. Anglers, again, retain that receipt. So it's kind of like, it's really not unlike contact tracing, but for live bait, right? If you've gone to a restaurant where you write down your name and your phone number, and if you need to be contact traced, it's similar, but with bait. And other species to avoid in getting into bait. This is a really harmful invasive species that has been spreading. It's been in the United States or North America since at least the turn of this last century, and has been spreading in the last 15 years to northern territories. So like Minnesota, northern New York, North Dakota, from the south, radiating out of Alabama and the southeast, and that is invasive jumping worms. They come with many, many different common names to be aware of. Crazy worms, snake worms, Alabama jumpers. I won't bore you with all of the Latin names that these 3 species have. But they were introduced actually as fishing bait. So they thrash violently and they can live underwater for up to 20 minutes. So honestly, you'd think, hey, that makes a great bait for fishing. But they're incredibly damaging to forest ecosystems. If you go onto APIP's online learning library, you can find some workshops that we've taught about invasive jumping worms and their impacts to ecosystems. So the way to identify if you are trying to buy bait and it is actually an invasive jumping worm, which you're welcome to report, just call me anytime or report it to the DEC. So they have incredibly fast movements, so they really do wriggle and thrash not unlike any worm you've ever seen. They're very large size. This actually isn't the best example. They could grow up to about 8 inches in length. And they are a dark red as compared to, say, like your night crawler, which is kind of like a pale, fleshy, tannish color. They have this bright white clitellum, which is the band that goes towards their head where their reproductive organs are housed. And other than that being a bright contrasting color compared to their red metallic-y bodies, is that it's smooth to their body versus kind of bumping up in other worms. So this is a really important species that we do not want under any circumstances coming up to the Adirondacks to impact our forest ecosystems or also our agriculture in the Champlain Valley. So this is something you can report either to APIP directly, New York State DEC, or using IMAP invasives. And the same goes for rusty crayfish, which I mentioned before. Voracious eaters, they're originally native to Ohio. They're generalists, they'll eat everything. They're really damaging to developing fish eggs and young rearing fish that have different life cycles and different types of water. And they're really ID'd by these 2 red spots in their carapace. Our former AIS program coordinator used to describe it as like if you had nail polish on your fingers or paint and you went to go pick it up and you got 2 spots on it. And their claws are supposedly much bigger than your typical crayfish that you see around. I think they're a little redder as well. So, you know, avoiding live bait fish in different types of waters, depending on what exists there, avoiding invasive jumping worms, avoiding rusty crayfish, reporting both of those species, and carrying, you know, your certified bait receipt are really important. And then also, so is proper bait disposal. So never release live bait from your bait bucket into any waterway. Dispose of that if you must onto land. If it's not a worm, if it's a worm, do not put that worm on land, please. But if it's a fish or a water, just do not put it into the water, but you can put it on land. Dispose of fish carcasses and unused bait into the trash is ideal and not into the water. If it's a super overflowing trash can, busy in the summer, maybe hold on to it to the next trash can. So make sure it's a solidly good trash can and a bag. Drain your bait buckets on land, never onto lakes, ponds, or streams. And always just encourage others to follow the same guidelines that I've just mentioned. You know, proselytize to everybody you know. And then pack it in, pack it out. So please don't litter. Always collect your lines and lures so that birds don't eat them, fish don't eat them. You know, it's weird to see how much people will litter and hurt the lands or waters they love. So it's important to just pack it in, pack it out. And just some notes about gear, because I don't want to go over time. But in terms of wader choices, you might have waders, you might be buying waders. There's 2 general directions you can go in. You have your boot foot waders. So those are where they're usually a bit more affordable. And they have, you know, like your rubber rain boot connected to the bottom of the waders already, or you have your stocking foot waders. So you're going to have a neoprene stocking foot, the bottom of your waders, and you're going to purchase separate boots. So the benefits of either is that your boot foot waders are more affordable, which is excellent, especially if you're just doing fishing. You might not like it, so then you didn't spend too much. But your stocking foot waders can be a lot more flexible, and you can get different types of boots for them, which can be great if you're hiking into your trout ponds, right? If you're going to go to a remote trout pond, you're going to hike into it. You're probably not going to carry your waders with you. If you're like me, you might have hiked in your waders directly. So you can get a better boot versus walking around in these crazy rain boots. So here's examples of boots. And so this actually applies to both types of waders, boot foot waders or stocking foot waders. And that is, this is a little bit of an older design, and in some states it's actually illegal to sell these any longer, but you can have they used to put felt, and they still do, so I'm sorry, they definitely still do, but they put felt, it's called a felt bottom boot, to create grip while you're in the water. So felt, I love felt in general, not for fishing though, I like it for arts and crafts. So the felt can make you stable, but it also makes a huge amount of nooks and crannies for invasive species to hook on. I'm back. Oi, I'm sorry. I think I just lost you all. This has never happened. Can everyone hear me now? Emily Dinan reporting for service.
Emily, yeah. I can hear you. Sounds good.
Okay, great. I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on in Saranac Lake. So, everyone can see my screen? Okay, great. So felt bottom boots can carry a lot of invasive species, or also Didymo, just technically a native, but you know, hey, it's changing due to changing water temperatures with it. So to protect your waters and to prevent the spread of invasive species, do not buy felt bottom boots. Rather, we recommend buying, you know, your rubber boots with rubber bottoms, or if you're going to buy a separate boot for your stocking boots, to buy something that looks more like a hiking boot with a rubber tread on the bottom. And if you want to even adapt your boots, you can also purchase these sort of treads that you can screw directly in. One potential exception for your felt soled boots, and Carolyn might correct me, if it is a water body that you are aware of that does not have aquatic invasive species, and you keep those boots on the same water body, they never leave, they stay there, they are living at your lake house, you've had them forever, you love them, keep them clean, drain them and dry them after use, and keep them on the same water body. So that is an exception, but we do promote using non-felt bottom boots. So a little bit about waders and gear. And so let's just get into clean, drain, dry really quick. Humans are primarily the vector spreading invasive species across the world. They're not moving themselves. It's the law in New York to clean, drain, dry your boats. And it's absolutely the best way to prevent the spread of harmful aquatic invasive species coming to the Adirondacks. So we have visitors from all over the country coming here, particularly as, you know, international travel is restricted. Folks are exploring new areas and they might be bringing invasive species with them. So on your waders, on your fishing gear, so that's also, don't forget your fishing lines, don't forget your fishing poles. Remove visible mud, plants, fish, and animals off before transporting anything. And after use, discard of that debris in, you know, not ideally an upland area, but in the trash. Do not wash and release that material back into the water. And invertebrates, so, you know, zebra mussels, when they are larvae, are invisible to the naked eye. And spiny water flea and fish hook water flea are also invertebrates that are incredibly hard to see, but incredibly damaging. They're hard to see and they're hard to remove. So you know, best practices, especially if you're in waters where you know these things are present, is to wash with hot water. That's 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and remove physically with a brush or a pressure washer. There are resources for you. So, you know, I don't have a pressure washer. Sometimes I don't even have internet. But there are boat and wader wash stations for you throughout the Adirondacks. So and tell your friends, proselytize this. There are free boat wash and decontamination stations throughout the Adirondacks. These are run by the Adirondack Watershed Institute. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of locations throughout every part of all 6 million acres Adirondack Park. You can find locations at adkcleanboats.org. And the Osceola River Association on the West Branch of the Osceola River has wader wash stations, which have brushes, good trash cans, not overflowing trash cans, and bins that hold a diluted bleach solution for you to clean your waders or your fishing lines. So drain all water from compartments, including ballast tanks, live wells, and bilge. Drain your boats before leaving the access site. Drain your live well if you have one, and don't forget your bait buckets. Drain those, as I mentioned, on land or in the trash. And dry. This is really, I feel like people don't do this one as much as they should. And I even, if I could use my camera, I even have my little clean, drain, dry hand towel here to show you. But drying boats, trailers, and gear before use in another water body is the most effective way to ensure that no invasive species or fish diseases are moving to a new area. Drying times can depend on, your equipment. You might have a lot of compartments in your boat. The outside might be clean, so you might need to use a hand towel. Air temperature, if it's really, really humid, like some people said they're in New Jersey, so it's the summer, it's really humid. Or like me, when you're trying to drain your boat and it constantly rains. So it depends, but dry your boat. Try to do it a minimum of 5 to 7 days. Use a hand towel. The sun does a great job for you. And when you cannot do those things, when you cannot dry, you can disinfect. So you can disinfect anything that comes into contact with water if it cannot be dried before reuse. And those decontamination stations, those boat wash stations and those wader wash stations count as a disinfectant. So hot water is an effective disinfectant agent. You can soak equipment in water that is at least 140 degrees Fahrenheit and use a power wash. And you can also use a bleach solution. So that's what's being used in the Osceola River wader wash station there. So bleach can be damaging and to your skin or gear, so do dilute it. 3 ounces of bleach mixed with a gallon of water becomes a 2% bleach solution. So that's suggested. But if you know that different fish viruses are present in a water body or an area, you can up that to be a 10% solution. Cool. So I'm rushing through because we had some issues. And I'm happy to stay on if you're happy to stay on. And now we have our Q&A. And it's 10:56, so I'm happy to stay on and take questions. You can also always send us mystery plants at the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. If you're really not sure, photos are ideal. You can put them in water so they sort of float, so they look like they did when they were underwater. If you really want to, help us with early detection, rapid response efforts. Cool. So I'm actually going to stop sharing, just in case that helps with bandwidth, but I'm happy to answer questions. Do you have any questions for Carrie Ann or myself? Did I say anything terribly incorrect? Cool. Well, any comments? I'll stop recording now so that we have this all organized. So thank you all for joining us. Hold on. I'm not trying